Now, New Zealand standards are some of the best in the world. We do know that. And our next guest believes that this is because we've protected our country from negative outcomes of genetic engineering experienced overseas. It is a polarising debate on what we want as a country, from scientists on each side of the fence to marketers, as well as our regional councillors jumping on board, creating GMO-free regions. Gene editing is different from genetically modified in its scientific term, and it can provide cutting-edge scientific technology for things like climate change and human health enhancements. But joining us now to debate that is GE-free spokesman Jon Carapiet. Welcome to the program, sir.
Thank you.
Could you please clarify, firstly, your background and why you're so strongly interested in a GE-free New Zealand?
Well, I actually came into the debate almost 20 years ago because I heard that the new technologies were being introduced via America, essentially, without the regulation and oversight or labeling that I knew consumers wanted. I work in market research in my day job. This is very much a volunteer organisation for citizens and consumers in New Zealand. And the debate, as you know, goes back to the Royal Commission, protests, lots of, as you say, quite polarised views. I guess where we've ended up is a middle path. There's no ban on genetic engineering or gene editing in New Zealand. What there is regulation. And the commercial interests in the science sector are saying that's constraining them essentially from innovating and making money. Some people say that's terrible. How could you constrain scientists from making more money and innovating new things? From a consumer point of view, and if you put the consumer at the heart of what brand New Zealand offers locally, but also globally, the sentiment's quite different. They want caution, they want testing, they want regulation, and they want labeling. Actually, most people actually really don't want GMOs at all, but they understand that there may be potential benefits in the future. So far, we've dodged that bullet. We've had really good regulations in New Zealand. They may not be perfect, and on both sides, people would say they're not strong enough or they're too strong. But the call now globally, and it's not just in New Zealand, is to deregulate gene editing, which is essentially a new form of genetic engineering, or new forms. They're different techniques. But what we've seen from the independent scientists is that actually they're not as accurate or precise as they thought they were compared with the old GMO versions. So the hope of, oh no, we've got it right this time, there are no mistakes, we can do some really clever stuff with this technology, doesn't stand up to scrutiny. So the question is, who carries the risk and where do the benefits accrue? And at the moment, the consumer and New Zealand farmers would be exposed to risks, not necessarily benefits, because it's all promises without actual delivery, for the interests of commercializing science. And we believe that if you do put the global consumer and New Zealand people at the heart of the debate, they want regulation, and it's not in our interest to deregulate gene editing.
So many things to discuss. When it comes to the difference between genetically modified organisms and the CRISPR technology of gene editing, there is some considerable differences in the fact of the way that morally it is done. And so therefore, I believe there is a proper scientific debate to have here in a country that we prize ourselves as world-leading science. And to debate your comment that it's here to line the pockets of scientists and the best interests of them. Jon, do you not believe it's in the scientists operate very non-commercially into the best interests of our climate and our human health and well-being of our animals?
I do, but I think regulation is the way you apply a respectable lens over commercial pressures to commercialize the science. And let's not forget, there already existed, there's an opportunity cost for investing in gene editing and genetic engineering, which New Zealand has spent a lot of millions of dollars doing without commercializing it. For example, if someone said to me, oh, well, how can we reduce methane? Well, we know this. Dairy NZ did research 10 years ago on mixed forage as a way of reducing methane emissions from our cows without genetic engineering them. And even now, and I do see some of the farmer press, there's lots of things going on globally and locally, which are not technical fixes in that scientific sense, but they do solve some of the problems. So more systems thinking rather than magic bullets. And I'm certainly not trying to argue that the scientists trying to commercialize what they're doing are doing it for the wrong reasons. But we cannot deny that commercial pressures usually end up in compromising standards because you're trying to make a buck. You may be trying to do other things as well.
Okay.
But that's why we're talking about regulation, not bans.
All right.
There's no ban on GE in New Zealand. You need to regulate it.
I want to ask you on terms of regulation and, of course, consumer perception. Consumer perception drives regulation, and we have a lot of populist policy that's being driven. We've seen that by Greenpeace's very clever way of providing submissions into the essential freshwater debate around this nitrogen cap and how that can be amended. So, therefore, do you believe that there has been thorough debate to reach to a point nationally of what we stand for, that regional councils should have gone off on their own to protect the market of the produce from those regions?
Well, I guess I don't think they have gone off their own. They've listened to the communities. They've also listened to their export markets. If you talk to dairy exporters into the United States, the biggest sector in America is the non-GMO project, the non-GM sector, because they've got so much GE in their system. It was sold to Americans or introduced into the American market without that public consultation or awareness. And as I say, I think we're talking about a middle path. No one is trying to ban research. No one is trying to ban ethical uses of technology if they are regulated and tested. But at the same time, we know that consumers, especially in a kind of post-COVID time, want to be able to trust a brand. And Brand New Zealand has got that. This is not the time to be deregulating some of the highest standards on the world that protect us from the risks of GMOs, to say, well, let's commercialize them. It's almost the opposite direction from what the sentiment and consumer perceptions are saying about New Zealand. Safe, natural, organic, ethical, sustainable are the macro trends that New Zealand can benefit from. And yes, gene science can definitely do research in the lab, as we do now in medicine. So no one is rejecting the technology. They're rejecting its implementation in the open environment, in our mainstream food system for export, and basically with the proposal that we deregulate gene editing, which is a very powerful technology.
Jon, I've got an idea. And your role in marketing, how can we receive a significant premium and return that to farmers beyond the farm gate who are competing against cheap, genetically engineered food that's cell-based, as well as, of course, highly subsidised countries around the world that they compete against?
Well, it's about branding, and Brand New Zealand, as I say, should be about ethical, sustainable. I know we're not perfect. No one is, actually. No country in the world is going to be perfect. But the more our farmers and our exporters can talk about the New Zealand story as not being a technical science fiction with gene editing, there may be a role for the research, but actually go the natural, sustainable, ethical work. Prince Charles used this term a decade ago, work with the grain of nature, look at systems rather than magic bullets to fix a problem, because often it's the system around the problem that actually generates the solution. So as I say, mixed forage is a solution to a monoculture of ryegrass. And Dairy NZ could show that it gave animals healthier outcomes, maintained production, and gave them that less methane emissions. Yeah, we haven't adopted that nationally, partly because there's no onus on the farmers and no onus on the retailers of ryegrass to say, let's change our system.
And the reason
that's what needs to be happening.
And I need to say this, that the reason for my last question did err on the side of sarcasm, Jon, because of the fact that the rise of regulation and the way of farming in this country to achieve this utopia that everybody wants needs to have a huge price come in above commodity to be able to do and work with nature on these massive challenges, as opposed to some of these faster solutions.
Well, and again, let's not be fooling ourselves. The promised solutions of GMO version 1 haven't materialized. There has been no significant increase in yields. There's actually been a lot of increase in the pesticides used. And as you know, poor old Bayer, who own Monsanto, are being sued for billions of dollars for their use of glyphosate and the people who got sick. So there's lots of promises, and there have been for many decades. But as I say, there's often an alternative system approach to be considered. We must consider the risks and benefits and who they fall onto. And I guess the argument is we've been well protected by the regulations we've had so far. It seems crazy to be deregulating gene editing, a very powerful technology, just kind of because somebody asked us to, which is commercial pressures. We've been well served by regulation. The consumers expect testing of what you've done to the genetic sequences. And if you don't have that, we're actually opening ourselves to a very major problem in the future. You've got to know what you've done with the gene editing, and you've got to reassure consumers that you've looked, you've tested it, and it is safe. And I would say you should also give consumers the choice to not eat it anyway. But at the end of the day, as you say, farmers are competing. And I tell you, the race to the bottom, this lowest common denominator, this deregulation of gene editing in Australia and America, is very much in the interests of our competitors, because it makes our point of difference in the market, which is GM-free, perceived as clean and green, and let's carry on in that direction, ethical and sustainable, let's carry on in that direction. But that's our point of difference in the market. You don't join the other guys and throw it in and say, well, let's have unregulated gene editing, so we've got no point of difference. We've got no promise to consumers in China, in America, in New Zealand to say, look, our food is definitely safe. And even if we are ending up using gene science in some way, we test it, we regulate it, we label it, we keep it out of a forced system.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us, Jon Carapiet from GE Free New Zealand. Jon, I know you're calling for politicians to keep regulations on gene editing. In the last week in politics, I think you're safe, because this seems like way too hard basket from what they've got going on.
It's interesting, but the scientists from the Royal Society and the former chief scientist, Sir Peter Gluckman, are very vocal in saying, look, we've got to deregulate. Well, we're saying we don't agree. There may be some changes in the regulation, but to shoot ourselves in the foot by deregulating gene editing just at the time when people are looking for safety and security and certainty of where things come from is just basically not right.
Thank you so much for taking the time to share with you your side of the GMO debate. Of course, it's been going on for, as Jon said there, 20 years.
This is Sarah's Country.